Okay, welcome to our webinar, No Profits on Pandemic. Thanks for joining us. My name is Cedric Reichel. I'm the facilitator of this webinar in behalf of Action Solidarité Tiers-Monde in Luxembourg, an ONG working for more than 50 years on campaigning on solidarity with the people from the Global South. We are organizing this webinar together with Antoni Moliner from ALAN and Dr. Joshua San Pedro from the Philippines, UNPH, and I'm sitting in the offices of the ASTM, and with me is Lisa Even, responsible for the technical supply today. Just a small disclaimer at the beginning, the working language of today's webinar will be English, which is not the mother tongue of any of the presenters today. So you will hear very different accents and very different dialects, and we will all try to speak slowly and try to pronounce in a good way. But if there is a problem with some technical expressions or terminology, please write in the chat and the presenters will try to come back to you and explain the notion in more detail. Okay, we also transmit the webinar on Facebook, and we will also have a look in that chat if some people would write in that chat. You on Zoom, you can write in the Q&A any questions you have to the presenters, and you can also ask in the chat if you have any technical issues or if you have general questions. So please use the chat not for specific questions on the topics which will be covered by our presenters. Okay, so I would now like to present to you the agenda for today. The first presentation will be from Antoni Moliner on the general development of the vaccination campaign and the global issues on that. After that, Dr. Joshua San Pedro from the Philippines will give an insight on the specific situation on the Philippines, and Antoniya Argirova, campaign manager for ASTM, will give a short resume of the position of the Luxembourgish government and present the position of ASTM. Yeah, it's okay. I will now leave anyway to Antoni Moliner, who's a senior expert on cancer and rare diseases for the European Commission, member of Luxembourg Comité National pour Maladies Rares, ALAN, and he's an expert on vaccination campaigns, and he will give us a short overview of the development of the last year. And also explain a little bit the different positions of the European Commission, European Parliament, and what could be done for an acceleration of the vaccination campaigns, especially in countries of the poorer, of the Global South. You will share presentation, is that correct?
Okay, I hope that you can see me, you can see the presentation. And of course, at very first, a big thank you to ASTM, Action Solidarité Tiers-Monde in Luxembourg, for the invitation today to share these minutes in trying to present a little which is the situation in relation to vaccines and vaccination at a global perspective. First of all, what is, well, I'm, as Cedric has very well explained, expert notably in genetic diseases and in cancer. Infectious diseases is not my first domain of activity, but of course, at this moment, I should say that every people as working and acting in the health sector, we are all confronted to the problems of COVID. And this is absolutely necessary to resolve this crisis in which we are, if we want really to engage a new situation in which cooperation, collaboration between all the people living all around the world in any part of the world can be in a healthy situation. I tried to maybe looking for a title for my presentation. Finally, I decided that maybe it will be better to use a concept that is becoming a new concept everywhere at this moment, which is the vaccine diplomacy. You know very well that during time and time, when we talk about diplomacy, intending by diplomacy the relations between the different states all around the world, we talk about economic diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, military diplomacy, unfortunately. And it exists a lot of concepts that reflects which is the situation in terms of how the countries act in relation to the others, practicing what is called diplomacy. But nowadays, there is more and more a concept that is not new, but it's becoming very important, which is the vaccine diplomacy. Unfortunately, vaccination becomes also a part of the diplomacy, a part of the way in which countries assumes their relationships one between others. And I think it was interesting to place this vaccine diplomacy as a little one of the most important words in the present situation. Of course, there are a lot of definitions of what is vaccine diplomacy, but in general, everyone can be agreed that the vaccine diplomacy is the use of vaccines to improve a country's diplomatic relationship and influence of other countries. It's a set of diplomatic measures taken to ensure access to best practices in the development of potential vaccines, creating multilateral cooperation between countries, conducting joint research and development, ensuring that production of a certain vaccine is feasible in another member state, etc., etc. This is a little the concept that is being used at this moment in the relations between the European Union and also the United States with the rest of the countries, and of course, for the relations between China, Russia, and the rest of the countries. I will not to focus too much in the vaccine diplomacy, which is being used by China and Russia, because we don't have enough time to develop all, and I will probably base my speech on the vaccine diplomacy, which is conducted here in the European Union. Of course, it's not a new concept, and it will not give you all the history of the vaccine diplomacy. It's very old. In fact, in the 18th century, during the Napoleonic Wars, is the moment in which the vaccine diplomacy for the smallpox starts. After it was very used by France during the time of Louis Pasteur, when he discovered the first vaccines, important vaccines for rabies, etc. It was used by France in the relations with Indochina, with North Africa. During the Cold War, United States and the Soviet Union also used it in a constructive and productive way, the vaccine diplomacy, in order to expand the fight against the polio, developing the oral polio vaccines, also the cooperation between the USA and the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, permits the eradication and the elimination of the smallpox all around the world. That was, I think, the last case of smallpox. It was in Somalia in the year 66, which in a way or another shows that vaccination has been always a problem, factor in the international relations. It's not new that now we are talking again about vaccine diplomacy. Of course, that has led to the creation of instruments. One of the most known instruments is the Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccine Immunization, that was created and has been also efficient combating the rotavirus and the Haemophilus influenza and developing vaccines for pneumococcal diseases, etc., etc. And during this 21st century, very international efforts has been conducted in order to respond to crises in a global perspective, needing vaccines for diseases of pandemic potential. Then we can say that, politically speaking, we are not in a new situation. Today, we have vaccines that can protect against 26 potentially deadly infections. From these, 11 are considered essential for childhood. Of course, we have also the, as you know, diseases against meningitis, cholera, etc., etc. And there are always many challenges in getting these life-saving vaccines to all children that needs all around the world. And a little to finalize this first part, trying to explain you what is the vaccine diplomacy, we can say that there are, unfortunately, we are not covering all the situations around the world, and the last data in 2019 shows that approximately 19.7, 20 million children all around the world didn't receive any routine immunizations at all. Even existing all these instruments, the vaccination global campaigns have not attained at all the objectives of immunizing the global population of the world against all these diseases that could be covered by vaccines. We have several barriers to vaccination that I will not detail, but are also important at this moment: the high prices of the vaccines, trying to get the vaccines where the children are, too many clinical visits, and in the case of COVID, when you need to be 2 times for receiving a vaccine, is not a very good idea in a lot of regions of the world. And of course, you need to keep vaccines cold in hot climates, and this is particularly tragic in the case of vaccines of COVID, like Pfizer, that you need, that, as you know, they need a very, very cold environment to be preserved, and this is not very easy to do in the most parts of the world. And finally, children that are not vaccinated during the time that they should be vaccinated, the problem is after they are excluded from all the free national vaccine programs when they get older based on their age. And this is a problem because this not vaccination for traditional diseases is now a reason for exclusion of the vaccination of COVID in a lot of countries, which is the situation that we can describe now according to the calculations and the analysis that have been done by the Economist, the intelligence unit of the Economist, a very prestigious publication. And you can see this description, this card of the world that tries to describe when the widespread and total vaccination could be achieved in the most part of the countries. You see different colors. The first color, which is a blue deep color, you see that there are the countries that by late 2021 theoretically could be practically with a full coverage of the population by vaccination. You can see the European Union and the most part of the countries, also the European Economic Space. You can see the United States and other countries as Uruguay, as Chile, Singapore, Hong Kong. These are the countries that really we can suppose, with the data that we have today, that at the end of 2021, they should be fully covered. After we have a second group of countries with a blue color more less deep, and these are the countries in which it is supposed that by mid 2022 they can maybe have the total coverage of the population. And you can see here countries so important as Russia, as Canada, as Mexico, as Brazil, as Australia, as South Africa, etc. Well, it's not so tragic theoretically if this coverage is attained in the mid 2022. We have after a color, orange color, with the countries that theoretically will achieve the vaccination coverage by the late at the end of 2022. And here we have very important countries also as India, China. Here there is one change, because in relation to when the colleagues of the Economist do this analysis, Mongolia should be not included in this category, in the third category, but in the first, because they have gained enormous capacity during the last times. And finally, with the red color, we have a lot of countries all around the world that in the best situation in 2023, these countries could be covered by a full vaccination. And here we find practically all the African continent, also some countries as Malaysia, as Philippines, as New Guinea, and countries from South America, as Venezuela, as Bolivia, as Paraguay, and some countries of Central America. This is the situation. It's an unequal situation, a situation that not permits really to be happy and at this moment. What is important at this moment to indicate, and I think, well, unfortunately, maybe it's not easy to see the complete chart. It's also the conclusions of a report that was produced by Oxfam Intermon very recently. It was published the 3rd of June. And as you can see, in reality, these countries that appears in the previous card with this red color will complete theoretically his vaccination in 2023. But with the figures that we have, and with the rate that is being covered, and with the resources that these countries have, in certain cases, it will take 57 years to immunize the whole population. That's absolutely tragic. On the 1,770,000,000 doses that have been distributed and inoculated all around the world, according to the report of Oxfam, 28% have been administered in the G7 countries, and only 0.3% have been inoculated in low-income countries. This is, again, an unequal, tragic situation. Of course, during the recent G20 summits, they have been two during this year, 2021, we had in these G20 summits an engagement from the side of the world leaders to support the COVID-19 Tool Access Accelerator, ACT. This is an instrument developed by the WHO more or less a year ago, with the aim of accelerating the development of tests, treatment, and vaccines, and to ensure the equal distribution. But when we go to the money which is necessary to cover this full vaccination, the world leaders, they declares that there is for the moment a gap consisting in $18,500 million, equivalent to 15.1 billion euros, sorry. And this gap is not covered for the moment. For covering this gap, it is necessary the donation of millions of doses of vaccines immediately through COVAX. COVAX is the instrument, a fund created by the WHO in order to distribute this vaccination in all the low and income and medium income countries. And this is one message that is essential that you retain. The greater the circulation of the virus, the greater the chances that it will develop new mutations that generate variants that can evade immunity mediated by vaccines. It means, it's very clear, you can be very satisfied if your country in the developed world, in Luxembourg, in France, in UK, you are covered 100% of the population. This is really not reasonable to be satisfied, because if the rest of the world, the circulation of the virus always exists, it will be sure that this virus, because viruses are very intelligent creatures, we can say like this, and they can mutate and develop new variants that always, with the intelligence of the virus, tries to evade the immunity with new mutations. We are now assisting of the explosion of the Delta variant coming from India. The Delta variant is majority, of course, at this moment in Luxembourg, for instance. It's, of course, the majority of the cases in UK, as you know very well. But this is not only the danger that we have at this moment. We have the Lambda variant. The Lambda variant is appeared in Peru. Lambda variant has created first clusters in Spain, and probably this new variant will expand in the rest of the Europe very, very soon. I insist, if we don't have a global perception, a global combat, a global eradication of the virus all around the world. Nobody, even in the very developed countries, can be very happy and supposing that the problem is resolved. It is not. Really, we need to resolve this problem globally if we want to be successful in terms of combating and eliminating the virus. The European Parliament has reacted to this situation. They adopted very recently a resolution, not by unanimous vote. I decided to reflect which was the result of the vote in the European Parliament: 355 in favor, 263 against. And in this resolution, what the European Parliament was proposing, it was the negotiations, to propose negotiations for starting a temporary waiver of the WTO TRIPS agreement. WTO is the World Trade Organization, and the TRIPS agreement, we will develop later, is the agreement related to the intellectual property of the development of the vaccines. It is necessary to create this temporary waiver. It is important, according to the proposals of the European Parliament, that this voluntary licensing should be developed in a way that permits to share the knowledge. What is important sometimes is not only to share the vaccines in physical terms. What is also important in a crisis like this is not only share the vaccines, but share the knowledge about the vaccines. And this is a lot of the time the main problem. Certain countries and even the big pharma could be agreed to share a certain number of doses, but they are not in favor of sharing the knowledge. And I insist, without sharing the knowledge about the vaccines, it's impossible to combat in an efficient way the situation in which we are. It is necessary to create a situation in which the know-how, the technology could be transferred in a way that permits the production of vaccines in different countries as the United States or the European Union. It is, according to the invitation of the European Parliament, we need rapidly eliminate export barriers, and it should be replaced by our export authorization mechanism with export transparency requirements. We need to eliminate barriers. I insist, barriers for the circulation of the goods, barriers for the circulation of the knowledge. It is certainly a good decision of the European Parliament, and the European Parliament invited the European Commission to do efforts in this sense. And that was a little the decision of the European Union, in which the European Union invites the different governments to ensure that these COVID vaccines, treatments, and their components can cross the borders freely. It is necessary, limited at maximum, the use of export restrictions. The supply chain should be always open. The vaccine producing countries should be ready to export a fair share of their domestic production. The supply chain needs to be highly interconnected and should not be disrupted. That's the most important message. The second thing which is important is that it is necessary that we need to encourage producers to expand their production, while ensuring that those countries most in need of vaccines receive them at an affordable price. This is being partly done by the most part of big pharma companies. They are expanding their production. They are creating new units. I suppose that in 2022, when it will be new vaccines arriving to the market from other producers different from the four that we know now, it could be this probably more feasible. More producers, more pharma companies producing vaccines will be certainly a help for improving this situation. But it's important that the governments strongly encourage and support these vaccine manufacturers and developers to expand the production and ensure an affordable supply of vaccines to low and middle countries. I insist again, exporting and donating the doses, but also this should include licensing agreements, the sharing of expertise, and contracting, manufacturing, and new investments in manufacturing facilities in developing countries. I insist, we want to share doses, but we need also to share knowledge. And also in this context of the TRIPS, this agreement on the intellectual property, it is very important that this cooperation between the members, the member states of the World Trade Organization, should be a voluntary cooperation in creating a share of a compulsory share of licenses and allowing and willing producer to make a vaccine without the consent of a patent holder. And that could be a legitimate tool in the context of the pandemic. Of course, everyone could recognize and could be agreed that when a pharma company invests millions of euros, millions of dollars in the production of a vaccine, they need to obtain a return of the investment. We agree on this. But at the present situation, pharma companies are obtaining much more of the return of the investment. They have, at this moment, practically obtaining a full return of the investment. And now the only thing that they are obtaining are benefits. And I think that from a moral point of view, a political point of view, and even from an economical point of view, it is perfectly legitimate to discuss the need of having this type of enormous benefits from the side of the pharma companies. Okay, I will explain very briefly, because it's complicated and it will need a lot of the time, what is this TRIPS agreement. The TRIPS agreement establishes a minimum standards agreement which allows members of the World Trade Organization to provide protection of the intellectual property. These intellectual property rights and international trades allows you to protect your inventions, your creations, while providing you with the sole right to adapt or improve your inventions. You need, in this case, you have an exclusivity of the market, you have an exclusivity of the production, you have an exclusivity of the license. This exclusivity is what we are discussing now. And it exists at the level of the TRIPS agreement and in the World Trade Organization, a way in which this exclusivity could be attenuated, could be really discussed, and could be created and implemented in a way that permits to other members of the World Trade Organizations, to other countries, to produce in a way which will be widest and timely the distribution of the COVID-19 vaccines that the world at this moment needs. That's essential. We need to have, I insist, this agreement in order to have the capacity to share the knowledge and to share the production. And what we can do now, and I will finish a little with this, of course, there are things that we need to insist. We can support the proposal made by India and South Africa in the World Trade Organization to temporarily waive the TRIPS. And that was endorsed by more than 100 members of the World Trade Organization. And if this proposal is accepted, that could contribute to the increase of the world production of vaccines and what is needed to saving thousands of lives. It is important also to combat the fact that the agreements, the contracts signed between the European Union and the pharmaceutical companies do not include these clauses to enforce technological transfers. This is something that we can denounce and we can combat at the level of the European Union, and the role of organizations as STM is very important in this sense. We should regret in this sense that the Commission, the European Commission, has decided to allow technological transfers only on a voluntary basis. Okay, the voluntarity, the generosity is very important, but unfortunately we are in a situation, and also compulsory decisions, compulsory basis should exist in order to obtain this transfer of technology that is necessary. As I have insisted, we should support, we should denounce, we should endorse this approval of a temporary TRIPS patent waiver, crucial to increasing the COVID-19 vaccine production globally, particularly developing countries, and helping to defeat the COVID-19 pandemic and saving thousands of lives. That's very important. Of course, we acknowledge and we recognize the contribution made the European Union in terms of donations to the COVAX facility. Practically 1 billion of doses have been donated from the European Union to the COVAX initiative, but it's not enough, unfortunately. Okay, this is what is probably the most important things. We need also to address our queries or regrets to the pharmaceutical companies, because I insist again, they should at this moment of crisis to share their knowledge. They should share their technological knowledge, their patents, and immediately share their know-how with industries in developing third countries who have already expressed their availability to contribute to vaccine production. This is a limited number of countries all around the world that have this capacity to produce vaccines in a new terms. Of course, India, of course, South Africa, probably others. And it's important that these countries could have the facility to produce these necessary vaccines. Okay, the most important thing also is to recognize that we call for the full implementation of one of the health principles, recognizing that human, animal, and environmental health are interconnected. And it's important at this moment to have a health policy perspective that integrates all the dimensions of a health policy, and recognizing that the pandemics, due to the emergence of microbial diversity in the nature, it's something that could be, unfortunately, repeated. We have, unfortunately, we live in a world of the impacts of the climate crisis are exacerbating the risk of more zoonosis, the transmission of a disease from animals to humans. And we should also encourage, because it's part of the fight, it's part of the combat that you are doing now, that we need to drastically support all efforts in order to halt, to stop the global warming. Because if we don't restore and protect the biodiversity and habitats, it will be very difficult to stop this pandemic, and particularly to stop further pandemics. I finish with the same, one of the same slides that I presented before, and I insist again on this message. The greater the circulation of the virus, the greater are the chances that it will develop new mutations. We are assisting to this situation now. This situation will be repeated. We cannot be satisfied, happy in our developed countries because we are fully vaccinated if with the rest of the world is not fully vaccinated. It's not because it's unequal. It's not because it's a lack of justice. It's also because it's a danger. It's a danger for everybody, for them living in the low and in the less developed countries, and it's also a danger for we living in those developed countries. This is my message, and thank you to STM again for the invitation to explain my thoughts to you today.
Thank you very much, Antoni Moliner, for your insight and also for sharing your knowledge and very clear messages. This is always very good to work with. I will immediately now jump to our second presenter because we are already ahead of time. And I know that it will be very interesting for many of the people watching us. So I would like to introduce Dr. Joshua San Pedro to us. He's a graduate of both anthropology and medicine from the University of the Philippines, and he's co-convener of the Coalition for People's Right to Health and the community physician for the Council for Health and Development in the Philippines. Thank you for having us. Thanks for being with us today. And we are very curious to get more insight on the current situation in the Philippines, despite that you also had, unfortunately, not only the coronavirus pandemic, but also floods in the last weeks. We are very happy that you can be with us today. So please share your screen.
All right, thank you very much to ASTM for inviting me to share the Philippines experience, and especially our what we are facing with COVID-19, which is something that the Philippines is perhaps one of the worst humanitarian crisis that the Philippines has been facing on the entire country scale. So, all right, on behalf of the Coalition for People's Right to Health, I'll be sharing what has been the Philippines' experience with regards to dealing with the pandemic, especially in light of the developments with regards to vaccines and the variants. And so this has been mostly the story of COVID-19 in the Philippines, which unfortunately I will not be really focusing on right now. But these two pictures are basically the story of COVID-19 in the Philippines. The Philippines is very much a country that has a large population that has less than adequate housing conditions, especially in urban centers, in which when we have to deal with a pandemic, especially a pandemic that requires physical and social distancing, that might be how it will look inside some Philippine homes, where if you have to have that 1 to 2 meter distance, in the majority of the population that lives in very cramped spaces. Having 1 to 2 meters distance between families might mean somebody has to be on the wall or on the ceiling or outside the house if we're really going to be strict about that. So there is really a big concern with regards to our population density, especially in the urban centers, and how this facilitates the spread of an infectious disease. But at the same time, the government response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been mostly a very enforcement related response, perhaps due to the weaknesses of our healthcare system, that most of it has really focused on a law enforcement aspect. So COVID-19 really revealed vulnerabilities in health systems. So not just in the Philippines, but also in the entire world, especially in systems that have neglected their health infrastructure. So, for example, these are just two examples of how the Philippines has distributed its health centers, its access to basic healthcare, as well as its government physicians, or those who are handling the basic health services for a majority of Filipinos. So, as we can see here, it is there are really major inequalities with regards to how many people have to share a single health center or have to share a single physician. So the more orange or the more purple in these maps, it shows how congested the healthcare systems are. Now, this is data from 2017 and 2018. So this is before the pandemic, and with the pandemic, we are seeing a worsening case of our healthcare system. This is a heat map of how severe the COVID-19 cases are in the Philippines. So for some areas, so as you can see, those areas who are more orange or who are more purple were definitely predisposed to having worse health outcomes in the COVID-19 pandemic. But at the same time, other areas which seem to have okay infrastructure prior to the pandemic did have worse health outcomes due to other factors such as the population density as well as the actual functioning of the healthcare system when it becomes overwhelmed. So the Philippines is now on day 486 of a community quarantine, which is a euphemism for lockdown. So in the entire country, the Philippines has been maintained on various forms or various levels of community quarantine, from the most severe to the relatively lighter ones. But at the same time, the entire country is still under community quarantine. So the Philippines has been seeing less cases recently. Our wave in 2021 was in April and March, but of course there's still that threat, no, that some areas are facing a surge, but on the national scale, the trend has been decreasing. But of course, there is always that potential for cases to spike once again. Sorry, that's the cases for today. Sorry, this is in Tagalog. So it's 3,604 cases today. Uh, Overall, the Philippines has had 1,481,660 cases with 26,092 deaths. So compared to the region, to the Southeast Asian region, the Philippines is second overall in terms of the total cases, but we are seeing a surge in many other countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, which the Philippines is still not seeing a surge as of now. But still, in terms of the total cases, the total deaths, the Philippines is still second with regards to its Southeast Asian region. And with regards to its WHO region, or the Western Pacific region, the Philippines is still first in terms of the total number of cases, with Japan and Malaysia being third and second, respectively, and still leading in terms of deaths and new cases. Sorry, second in new cases as after Malaysia, but the Philippines is still perhaps is still the highest in its Western Pacific region. So the Philippines is still not seeing so far a surge in Delta cases. The Philippines has only recorded in its limited biosurveillance just 19 cases of the Delta variant. Um, we are still seeing a majority of cases coming from Alpha and Beta variants, or the UK and South African variants. But it is interesting to note that the Philippines has identified its own variant, or the Theta variant, uh, which is um, which is identified in the Philippines. It's still not a variant of concern. It is a variant of interest under investigation, but still, it's pretty much a realization of the fact that there are areas in the Philippines that really have been unable to really control its COVID-19 cases, and thus it's the inevitable rise of a variant that may develop in countries with poor COVID-19 control. So perhaps it's a good thing that the Philippines is still not seeing Delta cases and hence not seeing its present surges. But of course, again, we cannot let our guard down. There's still that potential for such new variants to come in and cause, yes, yet another surge, especially with regards to communities without proper access to testing or vaccination. So the local vaccine situation in the Philippines has had 13,196,282 total doses administered, with 9.6 million receiving the first dose and 3.5 million being fully vaccinated. So the Philippines has a tiered prioritization approach to vaccinating individuals. We started with vaccinating healthcare workers and then senior citizens, those above 60 years old. Persons with comorbidities were the next category, and then followed by economic frontliners, and then the indigent population. But since then, again, we've only vaccinated 3.5 million in terms of being fully vaccinated. The target of the Philippines was to have herd immunity by November. So it planned to reach 70% vaccination by November. But unfortunately, it wasn't feasible for the entire country. So the target was changed, and the target continues to evolve. The target is that the NCR, or the National Capital Region, where Metro Manila is, Metro Manila was targeted to have herd immunity by November. This was the target in May. This was the plan in May 2021. That by November 2021, Metro Manila and 8 surrounding areas were to have 70% vaccinated. But eventually, as the vaccines were having delays in arriving in the Philippines, um, they preferred to use another term. Instead of herd immunity, the Philippines started using another term, which is population protection. Um, it was changing the criteria. It wanted to use a different term, population protection, meaning it's not going to want to just get the 70% since it's not feasible. Instead, they just want to vaccinate those areas and the majority of the A1, A2, and A3 priority groups. But eventually, as we were seeing more delays in vaccination, especially in June, with so much shortcomings, as you can see here in the graph, it was going down. You know, the amount of people who are vaccinated were relatively going down by the past 2 weeks. Um, Now we are talking about 70 million people, or 70% of our population, being vaccinated only by the first dose by November 2021. So the target has now shifted. Instead, again, of fully vaccinating 70 million individuals in the country, it changed to 70% of those in 8 regions, including National Capital Region. And then now it is shifted to 70 million people being vaccinated by just their first dose alone. And this has been criticized because there is no such thing as a first dose herd immunity, and thus the targets really have been shifting because of a lack of vaccine supply. So, what are the vaccines that are present in the Philippines? So, this is the tracker made by our organization. The Philippines has 8 vaccines that have been granted an emergency use authorization by the local Food and Drug Administration. So, 5 are presently being rolled out for vaccination of the general population. So, that is Pfizer, BioNTech, AstraZeneca, Sinovac, Gamaleya, and Moderna. So that is the total of the 5 vaccines that have presently been used for the general population. Sinopharm has already been approved, but it is only being used for select populations, including some politicians, the president of the Philippines, and his security group. But it is not one of those vaccines presently being rolled out for the entire population. So the Philippines has a 7 vaccine portfolio with 4 different vaccine types. So most of our vaccines are mostly donated or procured. So as you can see here, majority of the vaccines come from donations through COVAX for Pfizer, AstraZeneca, for Pfizer and AstraZeneca, as well as Sinovac. But the rest have been procurements through Gamaleya and Moderna. We also received a donation from the government of Japan and the United States. So mostly the Philippines has been dependent on such donations as well as procurements, the most of which are coming from Sinovac or China. There are tripartite agreements between the local government units and private corporations. The Philippines is one of the few countries in the world that allowed private corporations to procure vaccines for its employees through government facilitation. So the vaccination that is presently going on in the Philippines is done through the government and partially through the private sector as well. So a total of 18.7 million vaccines have arrived in the country. And with the 2021 population of the Philippines being at 109 million, the total fully vaccinated individuals is merely at 3.2%. So the 3.2% as of now, as the first speaker mentioned, it was going to really take until 2023 until the Philippines can reach these targets of herd immunity. But especially with how slow the present vaccine rollout is going on, with vaccinating only around 100,000 people per day. Right, so the Philippines lacks local production, unlike its neighbors like Indonesia and Malaysia, who are able to produce vaccines through deals with foreign companies and creating them through national pharmaceutical firms, as well as India and Cuba. The Philippines currently does not have local production. It actually used to have local production back in the 70s, as well as during the American colonial era. We used to produce BCG vaccines for tuberculosis as well as anti-cobra venom, but unfortunately, this is how it looks now. No? This is how it looked a few years ago. It became a dilapidated dilapidated building. It was abandoned. It was sold to become a mall. The land surrounding it has been converted into a mall, and the building has now been refurbished because it looks unsightly to be beside that mall. So it has been refurbished, but it's no longer a vaccine institute. It is merely now a storage facility. So this is really the picture of pharmaceutical development in the Philippines. It used to prosper back in the olden days, but because of abandonment of local technology and science, it has been reverted to this and has been commercialized into that. Okay, and this really harms the vaccine production and capability of the country. So there is increasing vaccine inequity in the Philippines. The government has been acknowledging the gaps in delivery and global supply. So there have been apologies made over the slow arrival of vaccines. But again, the blame is put on the reality that 80% of global supply has already been procured by richer countries. And this is something that the government keeps repeating in order to deflect some some concerns with regards to the arrival of the vaccines. So the Philippines has been rushing to accept vaccine donations, like those from China, from COVAX, and donations from other countries, and is really reliant on loans. The Philippines has seen trillions of pesos being loaned to us through agencies like the Asian Development Bank and the Asian International Investment Bank, as well as the World Bank. So the Philippines appears to be helpless amid such a major global demand in the situation. So this is something that is the narrative that we have been seeing in the Philippines, that 80% has been supplied and we can't do anything about it except really wait for those vaccines to arrive. So even within the country, we already see the inequity among the vaccine brands. So given that there are areas that can only have cold storage with very limited capabilities. As you know, in the Philippines, we are a tropical climate, and thus it is really difficult for us to have cold storage facilities. And thus, some vaccines, especially those that will require -20 or -70 degrees, are limited in terms of how they can be delivered to the countryside. So, Pfizer, for example, which requires -70, has already been announced that it will only be going to tertiary hospitals in major urban centers. So if you live in the mountains, there's absolutely no chance of you to receive such a high efficacy vaccine. Now, but however, those vaccines that only require refrigerator temperature, like AstraZeneca and Sinovac, those are the only vaccines which will be delivered, to the communities themselves. But for the most part, even those with -20 degrees, like Sputnik V and Moderna, will only really be brought to hospitals. Now, but they're not really brought to the level of the community. So from the local level to the international level, we see that inequality, that other countries were able to purchase more than what their populations need. Again, this echoing of that 80% being purchased by rich countries. Vaccine diplomacy was mentioned earlier, and some countries are able to produce for their own communities and populations, but not the Philippines. And thus, the Philippines risks becoming left behind with higher infection rates in the future. So this is where the TRIPS waiver comes in. Ideally, to be able to change the situation. As mentioned earlier, it is not really helplessness ideally that should be in place, especially in light of the fact that there is something being done on the international level. But however, this isn't really discussed in the Philippines. The Despite the reality that the TRIPS waiver has been gaining ground, especially with support from the Philippines' allies like the US and China, and even Russia has been supporting the TRIPS waiver. Even the WHO as a whole seems to be supporting for those moves, but the Philippines, unfortunately, is not really discussing such a move, despite the Philippines being mentioned in the initial map by being a general supporter of the TRIPS waiver. The Philippines has not really advocated for it on a wider scale. So, in term, the news about it is fairly limited. Recently, we have, sorry, this one first. In May 2021, this is the first time the TRIPS waiver was even mentioned in the Philippines, in which the Department of Trade and Industry even said that voluntary licensing should be the norm instead of a TRIPS waiver, because there's already some pessimism that the TRIPS waiver would even be passed in the first place, given the lack of consensus. So even our leaders in trade and industry were mentioning that voluntary licensing should be pushed for instead, because it cannot be done unilaterally. So the discourse is that it is a supply issue where vaccine manufacturers cannot keep up with global demand, instead of being looked at as an intellectual property issue. So this is the standpoint of the Department of Trade and Industry. While the Intellectual Property Office of the Philippines is even urging caution for supporting the TRIPS waiver, because according to them, it may affect global trade agreements. So, because it would have implications on Philippine obligations to international trade agreements. So, up to now, several months after the initial proposal, these agencies are still studying the proposal. So, however, at the 74th World Health Assembly, there was this statement from on behalf of the country, but mostly through the Department of Health, saying that it supports a plan to remove barriers in intellectual property rules, without saying outright that it supports the TRIPS waiver at the World Trade Organization, but it does support the WHO CTAP. So it's a very weak statement of support for the TRIPS waiver. So as I mentioned, in terms of the government, the official government stances, there have been no pronouncements in supporting the TRIPS waiver. But there are members in Congress in the Philippines, especially progressive people's representatives, that have been urging the Philippines to unconditionally support the TRIPS waiver for COVID-19 technologies. And this has been something that has been pushed for by our organizations, the Coalition for People's Right to Health, the Council for Health and Development, and even the People's Health Movement Philippines. We wrote a letter in June, prior to the WTO meeting at that time, urging them to support the TRIPS waiver and to really realize the need for global solidarity during this pandemic. But unfortunately, that was not responded to. So we have been campaigning that the Philippines not waiver on the waiver, that the Philippines support the TRIPS waiver. We have been doing this through Twitter rallies in May and June, in which we tried to call for support in our leaders, because of the reality that the vaccines are not reaching their targets, and instead of claiming to be helpless amid the global crisis, that there is the solution in terms of changing the status quo. And this is something that we tried to push for, that it is a first step in making the vaccines more accessible and reducing the inequality. And because we are seeing already the inequality with the 9 new billionaires minted by the pandemic, and we need more equity in a public health emergency. So, as mentioned earlier, the threat of the variants are really increasing. Right now, COVID-19 herd immunity is at 70% with an R naught or a reproductive number of 2.5 to 4. But as we are seeing, the more infectious variants come in, if the more infectious variants that infect, let's say, 5 to 8 individuals becomes the dominant strain, then obviously following the mathematics of it, following the logic of herd immunity, these will have to change. And the herd immunity targets may shift from 70% to as high as maybe 87.5% if the reproductive number of COVID-19 increases because of the overwhelming threat of these variants. So there is really that urgent need to be ahead of these mutations through efficient vaccination and enabling public health protocols. And this requires equitable access to COVID-19 technologies. So to end, so as I mentioned, there is a need to demand the right to health in this pandemic, to strengthen our healthcare system, to focus on enabling communities instead of blaming individuals, that services should not be based on capacity to pay. And this involves really removing the aspect of profit in a health crisis. And we need to demand accountability and equity within our country and also globally. That because global solidarity is a necessity in a pandemic still without an end in sight. But although the waiver might not magically solve this inequity, it is definitely a first step in creating more access and a more accessible COVID-19 solution in terms of testing, tracing, quarantine, isolation, treatment, and the vaccines. So, on behalf of the Coalition for People's Right to Health, this is really the situation in which the Philippines and the rest of the world really calls on its governments to really not to waver on the waiver, that we need global and local support for the TRIPS waiver now and an equitable vaccine distribution now. So, in the words of the WHO, again, the vaccines alone are not the solution, but only one of those public health measures that are the foundation of our response. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joshua San Pedro, for this very insightful presentation. Thanks also for your humor. It was full of statistics. I think it was a lot to digest, but very specific on the situation in the Philippines. Information we don't have, and also graphics we haven't seen before, at least I haven't seen before. Thanks so much for this information. We are quite bad in time, but that's not really a problem, I think, because it's so interesting. So I would immediately like to introduce to you Antoniya Argirova, who will briefly summarize the position of ASTM and also the position of the Luxembourgish government. And I will come back to all the panelists then after the presentation of Antoniya, which shouldn't last more than 10 minutes as agreed.
Thank you, Cedric. Message is received. I will try to stick to the time. And thank you also to the speakers before me, because I found the presentations really interesting, and I'm happy that we are having these discussions today. As an introduction, I would like to say a few words about why we as STEM decided to work on the issue of vaccines. Our goal as a development NGO is the political, economic, social, and cultural emancipation of the populations in the global south. And we consider that the major obstacles in this emancipation are to be found at home, in developed countries, where the centers of economic and political power are. And the issue of vaccines has clearly become a question of power. On one side, the power of pharmaceutical companies over states, and on the other, the power of developed countries and rich countries in international forums. The vaccination campaigns have also become a question of social justice, and it was already said in the previous interventions. What we are seeing today is that the global distribution of vaccines is widening the gap between rich and poor countries, rich and poor populations. And this health crisis, like many others, is hitting very badly the poorest and the most vulnerable populations. These people, these patients, should not have to pay for the profits of pharmaceutical company shareholders. Just as an example, AstraZeneca paid $3.5 billion in dividends to its shareholders in 2020, and Pfizer $8.4 billion. Recently, I read in the media that states see vaccination as an economic strategy because it will allow countries to restart more quickly their economies. And I think this could explain in a way why we are seeing so many inequalities regarding the access to vaccine. The right to health is a basic human right, and the vaccination should be considered from this perspective and not from an economic one. And actually the economic strategy is not working very well either, because even states which have a very high rate of vaccination are having troubles restarting their economies as new variants are already spreading because of the shortage of vaccines. At the end, the way the vaccination is managed currently by the global community creates new forms of dependencies for countries in the global south and take us even further away from the emancipation of their populations. It was already said by the two speakers before me, but I think we must not stop to repeat that. In order to overcome the pandemic, we must find collective and equitable solutions. We need international solidarity. We need to act together in a coordinated way, as no one is safe at the moment, and this is the reality. So these are some of the reasons why we as ASTEM decided to get involved in the European Citizens Initiative, No Profit on Pandemic. Maybe Cedric could afterwards share with you the link to the campaign itself, as I don't have the presentation today. I will say a few words about this initiative. This is a coalition of more than 350 organizations from 21 European countries who wants to introduce a legislative proposal to urge the European Commission to lift the intellectual property barriers on COVID-19 vaccines and treatments and make the technology publicly available. And for this, we need 1 million signatures. It's a lot. Currently, we have a little bit more than 200,000, and we need urgently more European citizens to support this initiative, as the decision about the lift on patents is expected to be taken by the end of this year. And the EU is one of the main opponents at the moment to this decision. As a member of the campaign, we believe that vaccines should be made a global public good, free of patents, in order to increase production capacity and ensure rapid and affordable access to vaccines for all. This must be accompanied by wider sharing of technology, know-how, data, and resources. And of course, we're also aware that this will not resolve immediately all the problems. But as Joshua said, right now, these are important first steps. And if there is one lesson to be taken from the pandemic, it is probably the need to improve our health systems. And this should become a priority for the future development cooperation policies. There are many arguments why we need to leave the patents on vaccines. I will just present three very quickly. First of all, vaccine research and development has been largely funded by the EU with the public money. Second of all, there is a shortage of vaccines, and at the same time, there is manufacturing capacity that is not being used because of intellectual property barriers. And finally, existing initiatives such as COVAX, that was mentioned as well, are simply insufficient. If we rely on these kind of initiatives, it will take years to vaccinate the global population, but at what price at the end? So these are some of the arguments that we also communicated to our government in Luxembourg. We contacted different ministries. We had a little bit the same approach that Joshua presented, sending letters to the ministries before some important meetings. But unfortunately, we haven't received any response yet either. In May, the members of parliament in Luxembourg voted a motion saying that Luxembourg will follow the position of the European Union. And this is simply not enough. Some of the EU states already positioned themselves in favor of lifting the patents despite the opposition of the EU Commission. And this means that Luxembourg could do it too if there is political will. And the government, and especially the Ministry of Development Cooperation, should also consider the issue of vaccines from the perspective of policy coherence for development. We all know the pandemic had a dramatic economic and social impact on vulnerable populations in developing countries. And in this context, access to vaccines constitutes an essential step in reducing poverty in the long term. So we called on the Luxembourg government to become a voice, a strong voice for lifting the intellectual property barriers within the discussions at EU level, but also to defend its position at World Trade Organization and the World Health Organization negotiations. Of course, it is also important to acknowledge that our government also contributed to the fight, to the global fight of the pandemic. Last week, Luxembourg donated 350,000 doses of vaccines to the COVAX initiative. The sending of respirators to India is also a good example of solidarity. But these are measures that are addressing the medical emergency and not the structural problems at the basis of the unequal distribution of vaccines. And here I will come back to the notion of power, and in particular, the power of multinational corporations over our lives. We are all aware that some multinational companies have already more economic and political power than some states. But do we accept that the interests of their shareholders determine our lives? This is the structural problem that we need to address urgently. And as a conclusion, I would like to share with you actually a very fresh news from this morning, which is in a way very symbolic of the discussions we need to have. So according to research done by the organization SOMO, it's an organization based in the Netherlands, vaccine manufacturer Moderna is employing tax avoiding structures to shift its profits to Switzerland and to the US state of Delaware. And I will quote a statement from the main researcher, which summarizes very well the situation. Moderna's profiting from the vaccine is outrageous, says the some researcher. As a society, we pay 3 times. We fund vaccine development research, we pay very high prices to purchase those vaccines, and then Moderna uses tax structures to avoid corporate taxes. So this is all from me. Thank you very much. And if you want, we can proceed to discussions.
Thank you very much, Antoniya. I would just like to add something to the campaign going on. It's a European citizens initiative, and it should reach 1 million statements. And there are good news, because yesterday it was announced that Italy reached its 100% threshold. It's the second country after Belgium to reach this threshold. For information, usually an initiative has to reach 1 million statements of support, as well as minimum thresholds in at least 7 countries. So we are still far away from this. In Luxembourg, unfortunately, we only collected so far 400 signatures, and we should reach more than 4,000. So please, let's give this petition a push, and please share it among colleagues and friends. I think we only see me, unfortunately. That's not good. We should see all 4 of us. Okay, I think now. Okay, maybe I raise immediately the question which was asked by Julie Smith for Joshua, Dr. Joshua. Yes, can you please elaborate a little bit on the Dengvaxia scandal a few years back, if this still has an impact on the current discussion?
Right. So in 2015 to 2016, there was what we call the Dengvaxia scandal. So that's the procurement of the Philippines of Sanofi Pasteur's fresh out of phase 3 trials. Fresh out of phase 4. Fresh out of trial relatively, dengue vaccine. So it was a dengue vaccine given to children. It was a very politicized event in which it was used during during an election year, and thus it was seen as a legacy building vaccination drive, and it was many children were vaccinated with this vaccine, despite some public health experts warning that there is that risk of ADE, in which there is a worse response in children who have not had dengue infection before, and in which case, if they do get a dengue infection after being vaccinated, it may become a more severe version of the illness. And there were some children who were said to have died after being inoculated with the vaccine, and that was something that really boiled into a media scandal, with many individuals being afraid of having their children vaccinated. So all of the vaccines in general plummeted, and that is it resulted in the decrease of vaccines in the compliance with vaccine measures across the country, combined with the worsening state of health infrastructure, led to outbreaks of measles, even poliomyelitis in the Philippines, and has also resulted to some effect of vaccine anxiety in many individuals prior to the COVID-19 vaccine becoming available. In February 2021, one survey showed that only 18%, 18% of individuals in the Philippines were willing to be vaccinated with COVID-19. But the more recent survey that came out in July did show that it has increased to around 43% of those individuals who are willing to be vaccinated. But again, at 43%, it's still very far from herd immunity. But of course, this comes together with the reality of the lack of access. We are still seeing people who do want to be vaccinated, but because of the lack of access to vaccines, it is not materializing. So while there is that anxiety because of previous scandals associated with vaccination, we really have yet to see its effect, especially with the the mere lack of vaccines that are available for COVID-19. But it may affect it, but again, it will depend on really the bigger problem of access to these vaccines.
Thank you very much. Yes, the French government, maybe you heard that the French government announced yesterday that there will be an obligation for vaccination for health workers in France. It's the first European country to officially announce such a measure. Is there such a discussion also going on in the Philippines, or is this like not materializing because of the lack of vaccinations?
Well, in terms of the medical community, we're not really discussing a mandate that all health workers be vaccinated, but it is really strongly encouraged. But it is interesting to note that President Duterte himself did mention that those who refuse to be vaccinated, he threatened them with arrest. So there is that aspect outside the medical community in general, as mentioned by Antoniya as well. Most governments do see the vaccines as the solution out of this pandemic, and this administration, the Duterte administration, takes that seriously, even threatening people who refuse to be vaccinated with arrest. Although there is no law actually that 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 says that people who refuse vaccination can be arrested. but it's still really something being debated. It's not really, there's no policy in place that makes vaccination mandatory.
Okay, thanks a lot. What's your position on this discussion, Antoni?
You mean about the obligation to vaccinate the health personnel?
Is this, in your opinion, a privileged discussion, or is it important to have this discussion?
I think it's important to have this discussion because really it's very difficult to attain certain results in terms of vaccination of the population if you have a very weak health sector in terms of professionals not being capacitated and operational. I think the discussion is valid, and probably it's sometimes surprising that it's not something that appears as a logical attitude from the side of health professionals, but okay, this exists, and probably to adopt certain compulsory decisions could be a valid discussion. I think it's not something that we can reject automatically, saying that it's an attempt to the democratic principles, etc., etc. I think it's a valid discussion, and particularly in low and middle countries, I think it's much more important than in France, for instance.
Maybe a question to you, Antoniya. As you mentioned, the Luxembourgish government announced last week that it will donate 350,000 more doses to the COVAX initiative. I just read that in Luxembourg, so far 450,000 doses have been used for the population. So if you take these numbers, Luxembourg is doing great now. Can you really say something negative, or is it like, yeah, what's your position on this? A little bit populistic framed this question, I know.
But I think in a way I already said that, because I think, like Antoni said, it's important to share the vaccines, but it's also important to share the knowledge. And I think this, the sharing of doses has its limits, and many reports show already that it will not be sufficient. So we need to go further. And the next step is the patents on vaccines and treatments. So yes, it's a good gesture, but it is not enough, and it doesn't really touch on the structural problems behind this unequal distribution of vaccines around the world.
What's your position on this, Antoni?
Well, in fact, the Luxembourgish government used a strategy. It was to create stocks of vaccines that are equivalent to 3 times the population of Luxembourg. And this is a strategy that has been also followed by other European countries. And this is terrible, because here in our developed countries, we have the capacity to have 3 times of a stock to the equivalent of our population. And at the same time, we are seeing how in Africa, Latin America, and other regions of the world, there are no vaccines. This is absolutely unequal. And then, okay, at the moment of the Luxembourgish government attained the 600,000 members of the population vaccinated, it was the moment to release and to donate 350,000 vaccines in stock, because otherwise this stock will be loose. But it's really ridiculous. Finally, if you think this in moral terms, we had on our stocks in our stores the equivalent of 3 times of the Luxembourgish population, at the same time that people all around the world was dying because they are not receiving the vaccine. Okay, it's good that the Luxembourgish government does this, but thinking really in the policy that has created this accumulation of stocks, I am not so really convinced that I can say that is really brilliant.
Yes, thanks a lot for your clear position on that and for also your outspoken words. Dr. Joshua San Pedro, how do you think, can you explain why this petition, for example, which is at the moment happening, why it's not really taking ground or why it's not so successful? Do you think it's, it is the topic not, well, yeah, like, I don't want to suggest any answer there.
Right. So, well, Antoni mentioned earlier that even in other governments, there has been limited response. But I think in the Philippines, for the most part, when we try to talk about vaccine equity and trying to talk about just the injustice that is happening globally, I guess there is this narrative that the government wants to focus on, that it is not their fault that they are unable to really procure these vaccines. That it is the fault of the that is beyond them. That there is a larger issue, but we can't do anything about it. And that's something that people will have to understand in terms of how they want to show the narrative. That this is how the way things are, and thus when you have the chance to be vaccinated, be vaccinated. So it's also an attempt really to um, to push people into accepting whatever is available, despite some facilitations, for example, of the government to accept the donations of other countries, despite having some problems with data, for example, initially of certain vaccines. But now, again, the Philippines has 60 more than half of the Philippines vaccines, for example, comes from China, and the Philippines has been mentioning how grateful it is. Again, there's also that aspect of politics, of geopolitics, of where it gets its vaccines for the most part. But at the same time, perhaps the Philippines has been entrenched really in a lot of neoliberal economics that it doesn't want to entangle itself with discussions of removing patents, because patents have been seen as so important, as that global trade deals are so important to our development, and this helps us with loans, this helps us with keeping some financial structures intact, without questioning what really has to be changed in terms of the global health perspective. And the fact that the World Health Assembly statement seems to point towards supporting the TRIPS waiver, but at the same time, the leaders in trade, the leaders in intellectual property rights are reluctant to do so. It's really clear who is winning over, and it's not the health leaders who are in charge of the COVID-19 response in the country.
And maybe a question linked to that, and maybe also the last question for today, because we're already late. Can you please elaborate on the reluctance of the Philippine government to vote on the TRIPS waiver? I think you briefly mentioned that, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit.
Right. So the reluctance, well, they're not against it at the very least. So the Philippines did not block the waiver. It was mentioned as a general supporter, although it is not among those countries who agreed to co-sponsor it, like Indonesia and other countries around India and South Africa. But um, again, the reluctance comes from the directives, I guess, or the lack of directives, therefore, from the present administration to really advocate on this line. So I guess definitely on behalf of these of the many civil society organizations who are pushing for it, it really has to be a matter as well of information, of really helping a lot of communities understand that there are other options, that there is a bigger aspect of solidarity that has to be part of our foreign policy as well as our pandemic response. And solidarity is not really one thing to be discussed so far. So it really has to be at the core of our COVID-19 response. And that's something that our communities and the people themselves should demand. And I think that is really where the strength should come from in terms of strengthening this petition and the call really for global vaccine equity and a larger solidarity towards more equitable access to COVID-19 technologies.
Okay, thank you a lot. I know it's already late also in the Philippines. Thanks for being with us so long, and thanks for your openness and for all your input. It was really very, very interesting for us, and we value that a lot. Also, thanks a lot to Antoniya. I know that you also have a meeting and you have to leave soon. Thanks to Antoniya for joining us, and also for Lisa for the technical support today. With this, if there's nothing to add, I don't see that there has to be said something. So don't forget to sign the petition, please, and share it, and let Luxembourg be the third country to reach the threshold, please. That's the minimum we can do. And yes, thanks a lot.